learners, and welcome to the fourth lecture of this NPTEL course on the 20th century English novel by women writers. In the previous lecture, I introduced the figure and the work of Nella Larsen. I will continue with developing the historical context in which Larsen wrote her work, Passing, and which we will focus on in some detail in the next few lectures. In terms of race and civil rights, Larsen's early life saw some very important developments. In the year 1917, there was the St. Louis massacre, and in the year 1919, the horrific event which has later become famous as the Red Summer of anti-Black violence. That is, a lot of pogroms across US cities. This was also a time when modern Black presses and civic organizations expanded. In the years 1920 to 1927, the Harlem Renaissance became consolidated and began to take shape. Larsen enters the field of literary production. Between the years 1920 and 1923, Larsen worked as a librarian and published children's pieces and also some translations. She also deepened the Harlem networks, that is, the Schomburgs, the Salons, and Opportunity and Crisis. This was also a time, the early 1920s, when important developments in the larger world as well as the literary history took place. In the year 1922, two important works of modernism were published: the novel Ulysses by James Joyce and The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. Global modernism also began to crystallize in the same time. In China, Lu Xun and May Fourth writers began to develop and innovate in fictional tools as national critique. In Nigeria, early cultural nationalisms began to gather strength. It was this beginning which ultimately culminated in the work of Chinua Achebe. In terms of race and civil rights, the 1920s were an important time as well. In Tulsa, there was a race riot and a massacre which destroyed Greenwood's Black Wall Street. These are the riots which have been described in many popular American narratives, such as Watchmen. In 1924, the U.S. Immigration Act sharply restricted non-Northern European immigration, hardening racial restrictions and hardening the somewhat vague discriminations and inequalities and power dynamics with regards to race that existed at the time. As the 1920s began to move towards their end, in the year 1928, important events took place in the literary career of Nella Larsen. In 1928, Larsen published her first novel, Quicksand. For this work, she won the Harman Medal. It was an immediate recognition for a searching study of race, sexuality, and belonging. In terms of events in the larger geopolitical world as well as world literature, in 1928, Virginia Woolf published Orlando, and in 1929, R.K. Narayan from India began to publish with the first in the series of novels describing life in the fictional Indian town of Malgudi. Also in the same context, Mulkraj Anand's work, his writings challenging and in critique of the hierarchies of caste in India, and his explorations in realism began to follow in the early 1930s. In terms of race relations and civil rights, in the year 1931, an important organization was founded. This was the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Colored people was a term used in the early 1920s to refer to African American individuals or individuals with African descent. This organization began to take shape and enter national and public consciousness with the Scottsboro case in the year 1931. In the next year, and the context is 1929 to 1931, Larsen published Passing, and this was also the time when the Harlem Renaissance witnessed its peak. This peak also reflected the strain that the Harlem Renaissance was undergoing. 1929 was a key year because Larsen published Passing that year about two light-skinned Black women, that is Irene and Claire. And the novel described how these two individuals navigate race, desire, class, and respectability. The novel's interior modernism and sexual ambiguity make it central to Black feminist and queer canons. The novel also engages in some direct debates that concern the Harlem Renaissance. It engaged with questions of the new Negro debate and uplift. It engaged with Du Bois's work on double consciousness. It engaged with questions of colorism and intra-racial class hierarchy. It also engaged with questions of the new woman and sexual autonomy. It also used the modernist technique as a vehicle for the description, exploration, and a critique of certain notions of racial as well as sexual interiority. During this time, important events took place in the world as well as the literature that was being written in other parts of the world. The late 1920s witnessed the crash in the Wall Street, that is, the place where speculations about the future success of world capitalism took place. In this place, there was a crash, and this crash in Wall Street triggered the Great Depression. At the same time, across the colonial world, anti-colonial movements began to radicalize. That is, in the 1930s, popular movements against European or Northern European or American colonization began to take shape. Examples of these are the civil disobedience movement in India, as well as popular anti-colonial movements in nations such as Vietnam, Egypt, and several West African nations. In France and in the French Caribbean, that is, those Caribbean areas that were colonized by the French government, the movement called Negritude began to take shape and began to consolidate itself. The writers, scholars, and activists who were playing the chief role in the development of Negritude as an intellectual and political movement were César Senghor and Damas. Within the US, race and civil rights also witnessed important developments. In the years 1929 to 30, the US witnessed heightened unemployment and dispossession among Black and African American individuals. The Great Depression, which exploded, as I mentioned in this historical juncture, further sharpened and deepened racial inequalities in housing and labor. The next 2 decades were formative for the life and career of Larsen. In the year 1930, Larsen was appointed a Guggenheim Fellow, that is, was awarded a prize by which she was given a significant sum of money without any restrictions on performing any particular form of labor or professional obligations. She was given a certain amount of money to explore and develop herself culturally and artistically. As a Guggenheim Fellow, Larsen traveled to Europe in the years 1930 and 31. This was also a year when it is known that Larsen experienced certain marital strain. And this was the beginning of the decade in which Larsen's publishing first began to slow and then stopped. In the sphere of world events as well as world literary events, 1930 saw important developments such as Gandhi's Salt March, and in the year 1931, the Scottsboro Boys case began to unfold in Alabama, which galvanized Black as well as left internationalism. A little bit later in the decade, in the year 1935, C.L.R. James began to grow in prominence, and the phenomena of a Black Atlantic Marxism began to rise. The author Lao She published Rickshaw Boy in the year 1936, and the writer of Indian descent, Raja Rao, published the novel Kantapura in the year 1938. So all of these developments represent a growing and strengthening cultural representation and cultural reflection of widening intellectual current of anti-colonialism. While politically movements against colonialism were beginning to gather strength, in the cultural field, a lot of writers and their works began to reflect this intellectual trend. In terms of race and civil rights in the US again, Scottsboro became a transnational cause. The US New Deal was enacted in the year 1933, which would entrench exclusions, that is, between domestic and agricultural workers, even as it relieved others. In the years 1932 to 1945, we witnessed that Larsen began to withdraw more and more from publishing. This was also a time when fascism began to grow all over the world. Between the years 1932 and 1945, we witnessed Larsen's withdrawal from publishing and also the rise in global fascism, and at the same time, the widening of anti-colonial horizons. So, from the mid to the late 1930s, Larsen had to deal with a lot of accusations of plagiarism, which are contested today by modern scholars, but nonetheless, they were very real to the person living through this time. This was also a time when Larsen underwent personal challenges in the form of a divorce in the year 1933. And finally, perhaps as a result of these challenges or not, one cannot know for sure, the result was that Larsen ended up withdrawing from literary life and returned to the profession with which she had begun her educational and training career, that was nursing. In the sphere of the world, geopolitics, and world literature, this was a time when fascism began to appear as an extremely dominant and powerful force in the world. The Spanish Civil War broke out and lasted from the years 1936 to 1939. In the sphere of literature, in 1937, Zora Neale Hurston published Their Eyes Were Watching God, a novel we will study in this course a few weeks down the line. And this novel enriched Black women's vernacular modernism, a process of enrichment which can be safely said to have been inaugurated in an indirect and somewhat inadvertent manner by Nella Larsen's passing. Also, in the late 1930s, Claude McKay began to publish powerful works. In the spaces of Latin America, writers such as George Amado began to grow in stature. In South Asia, Ahmed Ali published Twilight in Delhi in the year 1940. And within the US, race and civil rights began to find stronger and much more powerful expression in the cultural development of the Harlem Renaissance. A federal redlining began, structuring racialized housing for decades. So this was a plan by which the architecture, the development, the urban planning of the American landscape was decided according to considerations of racial segregation. Because this was a time when the doctrine of separate but equal existed, housing began to be separated according to race, and to some extent that legacy can be seen reflected even today. Between the years 1939 to 45 were the years of the Second World War. Larsen was not publishing during this time, remained private, and worked as a nurse in this time. The literature and the geopolitics of the world began to develop in important ways. The Second World War reordered the entire political landscape of the world. The Holocaust precipitated the rise of human rights as an intellectual tradition in post-war Europe. In the 1940s, writers such as Saadat Hasan Manto in South Asia began to write literature which reflected unprecedented human suffering. In fact, witnessing became an important literary category. Witnessing took on a human and ethical imperative and also a writerly imperative. Jean Rhys returned to print in the 1940s, and her landmark White Sargasso Sea is published in 1966. White Sargasso Sea is a novel that I keep referring to multiple times because it is an important formal as well as political document in the history of Anglophone women's writing of the 20th century. However, like the novels of Virginia Woolf, it is a novel that is extremely canonical, extremely well read and well studied, which is why I have chosen not to devote specific attention or emphasis to that text in this course. In the space of race and civil rights, Black military service intensified demands for equality. There was a double V campaign in the year 1941, and A. Philip Randolph's threatened march pressured FDR, the US president, towards fair employment. In the year 1943, there were more race riots, and the most horrific of these were in Detroit and Los Angeles. From the years 1946 to 1956, this decade was marked by the Cold War, decolonization, and the rise of the civil rights groundwork. Larsen continued professional life in this decade outside of literature and remained largely absent from the public literary scene. In the geopolitical and world literary space, in the year 1947, the world saw the independence and partition of both India and Pakistan. In the year 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed. In 1950, Doris Lessing's iconic novel of 20th century Anglophone women's writing, The Grass is Singing, was published. This is a depiction of race relations as well as gender relations in apartheid South Africa. In the year 1952, Kamara Lay began to gain stature. In the year 1955, Sembene begins fiction, leading to African cinema. Within the context of US race and civil rights, in the year 1948, the US military was desegregated, a very, very important development and which laid the foundations of civil rights in the US. Perhaps the most important development in the history of race relations and which enabled the beginning of the civil rights movement in earnest was the Supreme Court ruling in the case Brown versus Board of Education. This was a case in which a family, that of Oliver Brown in Topeka, Kansas, sued the local government because Oliver Brown's daughter, a black girl, was refused admission in the school that was nearest to the family's house and was instead forced to attend another school which was for segregated or black children, which required the girl to travel many miles. And after the local courts struck it down, the Supreme Court argued that the separate but equal system was in fact unconstitutional. This Supreme Court ruling overturned decades of racial segregation and discrimination and enabled the foundation of civil rights in the US. 1955-56 was also the time of the Montgomery bus boycott, which was initiated by Rosa Parks. Montgomery is in Alabama, historically among the most racist and white supremacist states, culturally speaking. It was in this state that the individual Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in a bus, the seat which was supposedly marked for white passengers only. Both these developments tell us that late 1940s and the 50s were a very, very powerful decade in the beginning and the foundation of civil rights in the US. 1957 also witnessed an integration crisis in the city of Little Rock in Arkansas. 1957 to 64 were the final years of Larsen's life, and this is also known as the classic civil rights decade. Larsen lived out the remainder of her life in New York with minimal public notice and passed away in 1964. In geopolitical and world literary events, this was a key time. In 1958, Chinua Achebe published Things Fall Apart, which is today considered among the foundational African Anglophone novels. In fact, it is difficult to imagine Anglophone African literature without or outside of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. In terms of South Asian and partition era literature and writing, in the year 1959, Kurtulain Haider published the novel Aag Ka Darya, translated into English as River of Fire, which reimagines subcontinental history, both before and after, and in dialogue with the events of the partition. In the early 1960s, writers in the Anglophone African tradition began to grow stature, such as Nadine Gordimer and Aikwe Arma. In 1964, Ngugi wa Thiong'o published Weep Not Child, and this was a time when anti-colonial fiction, both Anglophone and in non-English African languages, began to expand in a very powerful way. In the year 1962, the Caribbean Federation was dissolved. This was also the year, 1962, when V.S. Naipaul published his iconic novel A House for Mr. Biswas. In 1963, Wole Soyinka began to rise in Nigerian letters. In terms of race relations and civil rights discourse in the US, 1960 saw the influence and the inspiration of anti-apartheid movements on US politics. In 1960, protests in Sharpeville, South Africa began to inspire sit-in movements in the US. In 1961, there were the freedom rides. In 1963, there was the Birmingham Campaign as well as the March on Washington. The Civil Rights Act was passed in the year 1964, coincidentally or ironically enough, the very year of Nella Larsen's death. And in the year 1965, Voting Rights Act was passed, which was given posthumously to Nella Larsen. Now, what does this context mean? A lot of events, I have run through a list almost of important and iconic events in the history of the 20th century. What do these mean for the text under discussion, which is Nella Larsen's passing? What this means is that modernism and questions of race and gender, that is, questions of literary history on one hand and questions of identity on the other, cannot be separated from each other. Passing is a Harlem Renaissance high modernist novel which is in dialogue with global experiments, that is, it is in the tradition of culture and art which was inaugurated by Virginia Woolf and James Joyce. That is true on one hand, but it remains anchored in questions of Black women's interiority. It inherits and participates in and intervenes in Harlem Renaissance and modernism, but it does that only because it is also animated by and inspired by feminist and queer critiques of both events that were unfolding around Nella Larsen, as well as the kind of culture and art that was being produced by Black and African American artists in her time. So it anticipates later feminist and queer critiques, such as those of Jean Rhys, such as other writers such as Kurtulaine Hyder's Gendered Histories, as well as Doris Lessing's Southern African Psychology and Politics in the extremely fraught and dangerous political climate of racial and gendered politics in South Africa. There were a lot of transnational resonances. The movement of negritude, which as I mentioned began to grow in prominence in the year 1930s, it can be seen to be anticipated in a way by Larsen's novel Passing. With the movement of negritude, Larsen's novel Passing shares a project of redefining Black subjectivity against colonial and racial categories, though Larsen's lens is intra-racial and intra-class and less transnational as negritude is. With anti-colonial fiction such as those of Achebe, Rajarao or Ngugi, Larsen's novel shares the urge to unmask how legal and social regimes script identity. There is a color line in Nella Larsen's novels, just as there is a color line in so much anti-colonial fiction. But this color line is turned inward. It explores relationships between two light-skinned Black women. The novel's drama is among the most elegiac and eloquent explorations of and meditations on the meaning of the law and how the law is lived in the everyday life of individuals. Specifically, the novel explores how questions of respectability, secrecy, and surveillance unfold under Jim Crow law, under restrictive covenants and migration patterns that shape where and how Black women were allowed to live their lives. The formal ambiguity and open-ended conclusion aesthetically echo the juridical precarity of Black life in the 1920s and 30s. I will quickly reference some key events between the life and career of Larsen and a series of historical events which shaped race, relations, and civil rights in the US. In the year 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson was passed, which legalized segregation and created the world of fear, suspicion, as well as anxiety and desire centered on the appearance of a person or the racial identity connected to that appearance. This world is the world in which Larsen wrote and developed her novel Passing. Passing exists because of the dynamics, the power, and the social inequality created by the ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson from the year 1896. 1909 was the year the NAACP was founded. NAACP, as I mentioned earlier, stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. 1919 and 1921 witnessed systemic violence against the African American community through events famous as the Red Summer and the Tulsa Massacre. 1931 was the Scottsboro case, in which we can witness a resistance and an assertion of identity and independence from the African American community. 1930s saw important economic developments unleashed by the New Deal. 1948, the military was desegregated, and in 1954, segregation emerged in a powerful way with the ruling in Brown versus Board of Education. Civil Rights Act was passed in the year 1964, as I mentioned, to coincide in an ironic and a powerful way with Nella Larsen's death. Before Larsen's birth, there were events in the late 19th century which also helped create the world that Larsen's novels explore. The first of these is a slew of laws in the 1890s, which in southern states in the US were known as the Jim Crow laws. These laws legalized segregation. And in the year 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson upheld the separate but equal institutionalization of racial discrimination in the US. Jim Crow laws were laws that tried to preserve some extent of racial inequality, despite the non-existence of some powerful laws which could have ensured racial inequality earlier. So in the early 19th century, it was legal to own African individuals or African bodies as property. With the legal abolition of slavery, it became impossible for white supremacist states to control Black and African American individuals. In order to preserve some of that older racial hierarchy, several states, especially those in the south of the US, passed laws which required separate and segregated existence for Black and white individuals. These came to be known as Jim Crow laws. And these laws were challenged, but these challenges did not succeed in changing the law. And one major event in the failure of Black resistance to Jim Crow laws was the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling. Plessy versus Ferguson shot down the logical argument that if a person appears to be white, then they can claim to be treated as white. Instead, the Supreme Court argued that it was not about the appearance, but about the genetic makeup of a person, which determined how they would be treated, that is, whether they would be treated as Black or white. In the early 20th century, when Larsen was a child and young adult, the NAACP was founded, and it represents the growing assertion of the African American community to challenge racial discrimination through legal and political means. In the 1910s, the Great Migration began. The Great Migration was a phenomenon in which African Americans began to physically move from the rural South to northern cities like Chicago and New York, and began to shape the Harlem Renaissance culture. The migration was inspired by the existence of better laws, the promise of a life of equality, dignity, decency in the northern states of Illinois and New York, and also the existence of long-lasting remnants of slavery and racial inequality in the states of the rural American South. In 1920, the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution granted women's suffrage in the United States and powerfully impacted debates on race, gender, and modernity. At the same time, however, in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan reached peak membership, and racial violence provoked intellectual responses from both Black and white writers. So we can see that in the years leading up to the publication of Nella Larsen's novel Passing, there is both an increase in the recognition of the rights and freedoms of the African American community, that is, there is tradition or a trend of granting citizenship, rights, and freedoms to individuals from the African American community, as well as a tradition in which there is a rise in the opposite kind of tendency, that is, the force of a conservative thinking which seeks to inflict violence on the African American community and seeks to exclude African American individuals from the public life of democracy, education, and progress in the 20th century US. Some intellectual developments that help us understand this contradictory development are the book The New Negro by Alan Locke, which defined some ideals of the Harlem Renaissance. And this was published in the year that Larsen began her literary career. The Great Depression, as I mentioned earlier, complicated these already complicated developments in race, gender, and class, and deepened further what might have been solidarities across racial lines. As Larsen's withdrawal from literary life stretched into the 1930s, anti-colonial movements in South Asia and the movements of negritude and the Caribbean began to grow strength. Now, this historical context will help us understand some of the key developments in Nella Larsen's novel Passing, of which we will begin to undertake a detailed textual analysis from the next lecture onwards. At this point, I will mention briefly that the kind of description of political and social inequality we see in Larsen's Passing, it straddles very complicated and fine balance between describing private affairs and public forces. There is a public force which determines that people with lighter skin will have access to more privileges than people with darker skin. However, what this public force means for individuals and how it inspires or frightens or motivates or animates individuals to make choices in matters regarding their private lives that cannot be predicted through a sociological study of race relations. In fact, this exactly is the mystery or the intellectual puzzle that Larsen's novel poses, which is if a person is technically, that is genetically born as black, but has features that make them appear to be white, what kind of choice would they make? Would they choose to act on a pride based on their genetic identity, or would they choose to act less on pride and more out of pragmatism? Would they seek to assimilate in the ranks of a lighter-skinned community in order to gain civil privileges and social opportunities? Or would they seek to assert the pride that they have in being born into a certain racial, although disadvantaged, community? The two individuals who are the twin protagonists of this novel make very different choices, and it is in the difference between the choices that they make that the novel achieves its unique intellectual and emotional power. It is the difference between these choices which also, in a strange and powerful way, draws these two individuals toward each other, even though they live in a time when any idea of such an intimacy between individuals of the same sex would be considered extremely problematic and almost criminal. So these are the cultural as well as historical foundations which lay the background for this novel and which motivate, shape, and create the individuals as well as their anxieties and energies that the novel explores. I will stop this lecture here. Thank you.